Google Maps might get you to your Aunt Helen's, but it won't show you the way to a secure and a decent future.
Hunter Lovins has created a roadmap, and she calls it a finer future. Next on the Growth Busters podcast.
Calling. Call the Growth Buster. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Welcome to the Growth Busters podcast. Here, we discuss our society's addiction to growth, and we do our best to chart a sustainable course for human civilization, because we've got a planet to save. Hi, I'm Dave Gardner, director of the documentary Growth Busters, Hooked on Growth, and creative director here at the ad agency of record for Planet Earth.
And I'm Erica Arias, co-host and co-producer of the Growth Busters podcast. For cutting-edge information about our culture's unsustainable love affair with growth and what we can do about it, visit growthbusters.org. Before we get into it, let's get into some listener feedback.
All right, we've had a lot of good feedback lately, so I feel bad that we're not going to share it all, but we're not, so get over it. We had a great one from Alan. Dave, I dig your podcasts. Thank you for your public service. I have a beef with the American public. The most popular vehicle is a pickup with bad MPG. Probably in second place are SUVs with terrible MPG also. Deserves an episode, unless you've covered it already and I've missed it. Well, Alan, thanks a lot for your email, and I know you meant Dave and Erica, I dig your podcast, so I will take credit for being Doug along with my awesome co-host, Erica, and you'll be glad to know that Erica and I have an episode in the works, maybe a couple, that will address this very thing. In fact, it's going to be big. The reason we haven't gotten to it is that we're doing a lot of research and pre-production, and we're scared to death. I think we just have to say, okay, we're ready, let's do it. But I think you'll like it. So I'll tell you this, I'll make a promise that we'll get to it within 6 months for sure. Hopefully within a month or two. Is that a good plan, Erica?
It's a great plan. We are working really hard over here, Alan, so definitely trust that we will answer your wishes very, very soon.
Because I agree with you 100%, man.
All right, so main event. This episode of the Growth Busters podcast features a very special guest, Hunter Lovins, co-founder of the Rocky Mountain Institute and co-author of the book, Natural Capitalism. Hunter shares with us today about her latest book titled A Finer Future. Hunter has consulted on business, economic development, sustainable agriculture, energy, water, security, and climate policies for scores of governments, communities, and companies worldwide. Within the United States, she has consulted for heads of state, Department of Defense, energy agencies, and hundreds of state and local agencies. As founding professor of the Sustainable Management MBA program at Bard College in New York City, Hunter has devoted her career to building teams that can create and implement solutions to the problems we face today in our fight towards a more sustainable future.
Well, that's a mouthful, but Hunter's got quite a career behind her and still ahead of her. And I don't know why, but I've been sitting on this interview. So this conversation with Hunter is not going to include Erica because you weren't quite in the fold yet, I think, when I had this conversation. So what you're about to hear was recorded in February of 2019. So the book isn't brand new, but it's still a book that's probably worth exploring. It's called A Finer Future, Creating an Economy in Service to Life. And along with Hunter, there were three other co-authors, Stuart Wallace, Anders Wickman, probably butchering that name, and John Fullerton. Stuart Wallace, as you may know, headed the New Economics Foundation from 2003 to 2016, and that's an organization dedicated to redefining what an economy is supposed to do. Really good. I would call them a sister organization. We love them. Hopefully they love us. And John Fullerton, I am a big fan of this guy. He's a former Wall Street banker. He was managing director for J.P. Morgan, and he saw the light. Founded the Capital Institute in 2010, and the Capital Institute, similar to the New Economics Foundation, is dedicated to a bold reimagination of economics and finance in service to life. And this guy, Anders Wickman, that I'm sure I'm not pronouncing his last name right, I don't know much about him, but he's a Swedish politician, so get that, what a combination. Anyway, it's an interesting book, and it's time for us to share that conversation. So I'm thinking, without further ado, here's Dave and Hunter. Well, hi, Hunter. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Dave, it's my pleasure.
You have 3 co-authors listed on A Finer Future. I want to give you a chance to tell me a little bit about your partners in crime on this.
Certainly. The book grew out of a conversation. Well, the conversation actually began with the King of Bhutan back in 2012 when he said, "Hunter, your job is to reinvent the global economy." And my reaction was, me? So I went in search of people who knew more about all of this than I do and tracked very quickly into John Fullerton. John was for 18 years at J.P. Morgan, left as managing director. He created a thing called Capital Institute to try to transform finance and turned out to be a marvelous partner in all of this. Along the way, also tracked into Stuart Wallace, who for many years ran New Economics Foundation in the UK and has been keenly interested in this challenge of transforming the global economy. And of course, Anders Wigman, who at the time was one of the co-presidents of the Club of Rome. The club was one of the sponsors of the original book, Limits to Growth, which basically said you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet, and that if we didn't control the growth of the economy, we would crash and burn sometime pretty close to now. Book was written back in 1972. There are many folk in the club who believe that we've left it until too late, it's over, and we're going to crash and burn, and oh, woe is me. And I was arguing, guys, we have all the solutions to the problems that are facing us. We know what to do. Let's go. Let's solve this. They said, prove it. And so the 4 of us set out to do just that.
Well, I have to say I'm glad you did. My practice isn't to just fawn over someone who gives me an interview for Growth Busters. I tend to be a pretty critical audience, and especially over the last few months, it's been pretty tempting to be depressed about the news. I've been tempted to hang it up and say, wow, we just blew it. And I really started reading A Finer Future with a skeptical attitude, knowing what I know about you and your previous writing and your talks and the fact that you spend a lot of time hanging out with corporate leaders, and they probably wouldn't be interested in your consulting if you were just walking in the door and saying game over. I fully expected that this would have somewhat optimistic approach, and I was fully prepared to come up with a list of why that can't work. But you really won me over in the in the course of the book. Shame on you.
I am so glad.
Yeah, I have a little bit of hope. So hopefully in the course of our conversation today, we can talk about a little bit of that. But of course, in one podcast conversation, we can't really convey everything that is in that book. So I'm going to include a link in the show notes and encourage our listeners to check it out. And in fact, we'll have lots of links in the show notes. For example, you mentioned the Limits to Growth, that landmark MIT study that was done back in the early 70s. If someone listening isn't fully familiar with Limits to Growth, then you need to be. And so I'll include a link to the Limits to Growth section of the Club of Rome website, which is a great place to explore the results of that study online. Of course, you can always go to Amazon, or unfortunately, you probably can't find in your local bookstore the original Limits to Growth book or any of the follow-up books from that study.
Well, if you're going to go in search of it, the better one to pick is Beyond the Limits, which Dana Meadows wrote in, I think it was 92. It's much more up to date. Dennis Meadows headed the 40 years update to Limits to Growth. But there are also a lot of videos, if you want the Cliff Notes version, that give a sense of it. And you'll also begin to get a sense of the split between those who feel that it's over and those of us who think that it's still worth fighting, that this is a very beautiful earth And I'm kind of sentimental about this human experiment. As George Carlin said, save the earth will be fine. It'll shake us off like a bad case of fleas. What's in trouble are the humans. And that is true. And then a lot of other species. The latest bad news is the insect apocalypse. We're losing insects at an incredible rate, and it's scaring the tar out of the scientists, and rightly so. Without insects, the human experiment goes away pretty quickly. We're losing the rest of life at a rate unprecedented since the dinosaurs went extinct. Sorry, scuba divers, business as usual. Perhaps as early as 2035, there'll be no living coral reefs on planet Earth. And the Amazon is drying up and burning. The oceans are acidifying. We are in a climate crisis. Don't do this because it'll put you in a very bad mood. But you can Google near-term human extinction and find what purports to be some pretty good science that says humans go extinct within about a decade. And so outfits like Dark Mountain in the UK say, grieve and then get over it. It's too late, so party on. And I think that's the most profoundly irresponsible position that we can take. The beautiful young woman, Greta Thunberg, had a lovely interview recently in the Financial Times in which she said people are telling her, oh, good, the young people are getting active. Now there's hope. And she said, no, there isn't. We're too young. We can't do this in time. It's going to take the adults. It's going to take us stepping up, committing to do what needs to be done. And the good news is, when we do it, we will create a much higher quality of life. We'll like the outcome much better, and we'll all make a lot more money. Doing what is needed, solving the climate crisis, can best be done at a profit.
Well, there you go. And you just answered my next couple of questions, so I can skip ahead a little bit. Who needs to read this book?
I would hope that anyone who cares about a finer future would want to read the book. Again, it came out of the argument of there's no hope, and it's our effort at saying, actually, even though hope is not a strategy, there is a tremendous amount that we can do and that we should be doing because it's better business, because it delivers finer communities to live in, because you will be happier in this kind of a world, and because it's happening. If you want to be a part of the new economy, this is what you'll be doing anyway. This is what's going to happen to you. It's what's going to happen to the businesses that you're involved in. If we get it right, we can manage a very benign transition to a finer future. If we continue to ignore both the opportunities and the risks and the threats, the next 10 years are going to be increasingly unpleasant. And we're seeing this now. The hurricane this year that wiped out Mexico Beach in Florida, the fires last summer in California, which, by the way, put the largest investor-owned electric utility on the North American continent now into bankruptcy. This stuff is real and it's happening right now, and it's only going to get worse. We're on a track for well over 2 degrees C warming of the Earth. And even at 1 degree C and a little more, which we are now, about 410 parts per million concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, we're seeing the effects of the climate crisis. So it's just going to get worse, and yes, it is coming to a town near you in the very near future. This is your future. And if we do 2 things, we solve the climate crisis at a profit. Number 1, I work with a man named Tony Seba. Tony's a Stanford prof, Silicon Valley entrepreneur, who says, inevitably, for fundamental economic reasons, the world will be 100% renewably powered by 2030. The 4 reasons and 1 business model driver are fall in the cost of solar, fall in the cost of storage, batteries, the electric car, and the driverless car. The business model is transit as a service and storage as a service. After the 2016 election, I went to talk to Tony. I've known him for about 10 years and said, okay, now it's going to take longer or it's not going to happen. He said, oh, I'm convinced it's going to happen by 2030, perhaps earlier, and we are right on track. So I started watching. Fall in the cost of solar, fall in the cost of storage. I'm sitting now in Colorado. We have a electric utility, Xcel Energy, which for decades has been in love with fossil fuel. Coal, natural gas. They put out in 2017 an all-source bid. Who can supply us 1,100 megawatts, any price, any source, y'all bid. They got back bids for 58,000 megawatts. The lowest fossil bid was 4 cents a kilowatt hour, natural gas. Wind was a bit below 2 cents a kilowatt hour, solar a bit above 2 cents. Wind plus solar plus storage, 3 cents a kilowatt hour. So base load renewable energy is now cheaper than any fossil energy. These are commercial bids. This is real. It's happening. The utility said, no. Bid it again. Our Cheeto-in-Chief put some tariffs on. So they bid it again. Pretty much the same answer. So Xcel said, oh. Went to the PUC and said, can we shut 2 coal plants and pledge to go 2/3 renewable? Now, why not 100% renewable, as both Hawaii and California have pledged to do? Well, give them a year. This is a whole new world for electric utilities. The electric car, China has said they're phasing out the internal combustion engine. General Motors recently announced the closure of 6 or 7 manufacturing facilities because they said we're getting ready for the electric car and the driverless car. I drive a little Nissan Leaf, and I can tell you it is a fine automobile. I have beat off the line a Porsche, a Mercedes, a BMW, a Mustang, and one of those big smoker trucks.
Where are you doing your drag racing?
On the streets. You know, you're parked at a stoplight, and yeah, in about 4 blocks they could beat me at a top-end speed, but at that point they're going to have party lights in their rearview mirror. And the driverless car, they're on the road. I was in Vegas in December and whistled up a lift, and up comes a dialogue box. Would I accept an autonomous vehicle? And I hit yes, yes. In the event, I got a drivered vehicle. But they're in Vegas, they're in Arizona. Waymo this week announced that it's starting its service of transit as a service, where you whistle one of these things up, and what you want, which is to get from here to there, costs you 10-fold less than paying to buy, fuel, maintain, and insure a private vehicle. At a 10-fold drop in cost, these things are going to sweep. Again, notice, no polar bears. This is not about saving the earth. This is simply about better business. And again, it's happening. Storage as a service. If you live in Phoenix, Arizona Public Service will charge you 50 cents a kilowatt hour for on-peak power. Off-peak power is 5 cents. So put in batteries for a couple hours a day when you got peak power. But if you have batteries, why not put up solar panels, cut the tie, and just stand on your own? And so an increasing number of businesses are pledging to go 100% renewably powered. Why? Because it's cheaper. It's saving them money. It's also more reliable. In 2013, it flooded here in Colorado. We were islanded. My ranch wasn't flooded, but we were cut off from going anywhere more than a couple miles away. Everybody was out of power for a week. We weren't. I have solar on the ranch, batteries in the garage, a Leaf. We were just fine. This is genuine homeland security.
Well, let me play devil's advocate here for a minute about this renewable revolution. Storage. Aren't there some real serious limits to storage because of the limited supply of the raw materials that are necessary for battery storage? Isn't that a pretty toxic technology?
You can do batteries wrong. And there is it's a corollary of the round earth theory that there are limits to any resource. That said, there is a great deal of the lithium that is now the basic building block of batteries. And there are new batteries coming on the market, solid-state batteries, which don't require lithium. There are lithium batteries that are vastly less toxic than the batteries that are now, say, in your cell phone. The lithium-ion cobalt batteries get hot, which is why airlines say don't put them in your checked luggage. Lithium ferrous phosphate batteries of the sort made by a great little company out in California called Simpla PHI, have no cobalt in them, so they don't get hot. So the Department of Defense has been using these in places like Afghanistan because they don't have a heat signature. If somebody might want to shoot a heat-seeking missile at you, last thing you want is a bunch of batteries that get hot.
Yeah.
So Simplify and a great little company called Sesame Solar have been going to places like Dominica, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands that were hit by Hurricane Maria, and installing microgrids on schools, hospitals, government buildings, so that people have power regardless of what the climate catastrophe does in throwing nasty storms at them. Meanwhile, you and I and the rest of American taxpayers are subsidizing FEMA to try to rebuild the coal-fired grid in Puerto Rico. Last I checked, there isn't any coal in Puerto Rico. That means they have to import it all. And indeed, most island states have to import the fossil energy that they use, which again is why Hawaii has said, the heck with this. We have ample sun, we have lots of wind, let's go renewable.
Now, the other concern that I've heard is that, as you write in the book about how we're starting to see some exponential growth in the renewable energy industry, it's still a very small percentage today of our total energy supply. And I hear the naysayers say that in order for us to scale up to really be 100% renewable, as you're talking about, that we would have to burn a lot of fossil fuels to power that infrastructure change.
Well, we have two choices. We can invest in using the fossil fuels to power the transition, or we can continue to burn the things to party on, and then they're gone. Either way, at some point they're gone. And if we have used them as an investment to power our transition, we're in a lot better shape than if we just burn them up for fun.
Good point.
Now, the Paley Commission urged us to do this as a matter of national security in about 1955, and if we had done it then, we'd be there now. Like humans everywhere, we have left it until very late. And so now it really is an emergency. Still, we have enough fossil to power this transition. Scientists from Dr. Mark Jacobson at Stanford with his Solutions Project to Christian Breyer in Europe have shown that we can power the entire world with renewables. And the more renewables we have, the more we use renewables to power the transition to renewables, as Elon Musk is doing with his gigafactory in Nevada. As the Chinese are increasingly doing, they have 20 of these gigafactories to make batteries coming online in about 2021. Now, if Tony is right, and again, all evidence shows that he is, we are looking at the dissolution in value, probably pretty complete dissolution, of oil, gas, coal, uranium, nuclear, the utility industry, the automobile industry, the banks that have paper in them, the insurance companies and the pension funds that are invested in them. This risks being the mother of all disruptions, coming at us within 10 years' time. And this is why I say we need to manage this transition very adroitly, and we need to get about it pretty quickly.
Well, good point. But here's an important question for you. Is that it? Problem solved? All we have to do is go 100% renewable and...
Nope, that's about half the answer.
Okay.
That stops the emissions of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. That's about 3/4 of what causes the climate crisis. The other quarter comes from agriculture, from the unsustainable way we're growing food. And again, the answer there turns out to be profitable. There's a man named Gabe Brown. Gabe was a North Dakota corn soybean farmer who was going broke. Because he was going broke, he said, I'll try anything. So first he went to no-till farming. He stopped plowing the prairie and inverting it, thereby denitrifying, decarbonizing the soil. He then started planting very deep-rooted cover crops, about 28 different species of plants. So he has a diversity of plants in his fields. And then in the winter, he turns out grazing animals who eat the cover crops so that in the spring he can drill seed corn, soybeans, oats, wheat. So he now has a diversity of products, including 4 or 5 different kinds of meat animals and grains. He's wildly profitable. And at the point at which he added the animal impact, he went from, on some of his paddocks, a little over 1% soil organic matter to now over 11%. That's carbon. He's taking carbon out of the air, putting it back in the soil, and doing so profitably. He's rolling climate change backward at a profit. And Gabe is only one of a growing number of regenerative farmers, ranchers, who are practicing what's called holistic management, a technique developed by Alan Savory. Alan Savory proved that the way the world's grasslands became the second largest carbon sink on Earth after the oceans is that they co-evolved with vast herds of bison in this country, elk, deer. In Africa, wildebeests, gazelles. Across Asia, the saiga antelope. All dense packed because of predators. If you're about to get eaten by a wolf or a lion, the safe place to be is in the middle of the herd, so everybody's trying to get into the middle of the herd. They eat everything, their hooves chop up the soil, they fertilize it, and then they move on to find new grass. They don't come back until the grass has regrown. And along the way, this coevolution of grazing animals and grass puts carbon into the soil. It does so because when a grazing animal eats grass, the roots slough polysaccharides, sugars. Those sugars feed the microbiological community in the soil, particularly mycorrhizal fungi. That's what mineralizes the carbon that's coming in from the sugars, from dead plant material, from the manure of the grazing animals. And that's what builds up the thick black soil that the pioneers found when they first came across the Great Plains. That black is carbon, young coal, if you will, and it's now mostly all gone. The UN says business as usual. Humanity has maybe 60 more harvests before soil loses the ability to produce food because we're treating it like dirt. We're sterilizing it, we're poisoning it with chemicals, we're running over it with machines. So people like Wes Jackson at the Land Institute and Joel Salatin at Polyface Farms and Will Harris at White Oak Pastures down in Bluffton, Georgia, are pioneering this new way of using perennial crops. Wes has produced a perennial wheat called Kernza that has roots maybe 10 feet deep that take nutrients deep into the soil. Where you have these crops, you don't need fertilizer. You don't want pesticides or herbicides. They're a cost, and they just kill all the beneficial plants and insects that are taking the nutrients out of the air, nitrogen, carbon, and putting it back into the soil. So your costs go down. You now are able to sell much healthier food. People are even willing to pay more for it. You're now profitable. So if you go visit Will down at White Oak Pastures, you'll see the little town of Bluffton, Georgia, which had been decaying and being covered by kudzu, is now coming back to life. Buildings are being rebuilt. because Will hires 137 people to run white oak pastures. His neighbor, commodity peanut farmer, has exactly the same acreage that Will does, 2,500 acres, but he employs 4 people. So this is community economic development, as well as it's the solution to the climate crisis. It also, as Vandana Shiva says, is the solution to the health crisis, the crisis in democracy. It's a holistic solution. It solves many problems while it enhances our profitability.
And you write in the book about this being a significant amount of carbon capture and storage. My sense of things is that the scientists out there are really counting on significant carbon capture and storage for us to survive this climate crisis. And I have been pretty skeptical about coming up with some new technology to just suck carbon out of the air and pump it into caverns beneath the surface of the earth. But you've written about something here that really gives me hope that carbon capture and storage of this variety can really be a significant part of the solution.
It's an enormous amount of carbon that the grasslands of the world have already pulled out of the air and hold in them, and we can dramatically increase that. So, for example, Gabe increased carbon in the soil 11-fold just by using animal impact. Dr. David Johnson at New Mexico State University uses a different technique. He takes dairy manure, which is now waste, composts it with green waste, tree trimmings, grass cuttings, and turns it into almost a fungal inoculant, a mycorrhizal inoculant, which he spreads on ground. He gets uptake of up to 15 tons per acre per year. At a ton per acre per year on the world's grasslands, over 30 years' time, we would get back to 280 parts per million concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. So we know how to suck the carbon out of the air, put it back in the soil profitably. Now, what some of the scientists are toying with is called direct air capture. It costs $100 a ton of carbon pulled from the air, $1,000 a ton. It's hideously not cost-effective. We ought to try the simple, cheap solutions first, and while we're doing it, revitalize rural community.
Mother Nature.
Mother Nature knows best.
Yeah.
She bats last and owns the ball and the bat and the ballpark.
Let's talk a little bit about something you write about in the book, this handy study, which I wasn't familiar with. First of all, I couldn't find the study, and I was wondering whether you know, is there a link to it somewhere on the internet, or is it invisible to us?
I can certainly send you a link to it. It was very controversial because it scared the tar out of people. It was a study funded by NASA, done by some applied mathematicians. Its full name is Human and Nature Dynamic Study. It looked at the history of collapse throughout humanity's time on Earth, found that it's actually pretty common. When it happens, it lasts for hundreds to thousands of years. You really don't like it. And they found it's driven by one or both of two things. You overrun your resource base, or you have high levels of inequality. Hello, we have both. The Oxfam studies have shown things like 8 men have as much wealth as the bottom half of humanity. And inequality is increasing because of an ideology, a story that we have fallen prey to. The story is called neoliberalism. 47, Europe's in ruins. Ludwig von Mises is appalled at what National Socialism has done to trash Europe. Milton Friedman believes that the individual is the only legitimate economic actor. He had some assumptions which turn out to be bad science. So, for example, they were firmly convinced that we're all greedy bastards. But that's okay, they said, because markets are perfect. And in a perfect market, you against me, will somehow aggregate to the greater good for all. No, it won't. It hasn't, as the inequality statistics show. It has brought humanity to the edge of a cliff. And as my old boss, Dave Brower, said, when you're standing at the edge of a cliff, the only progressive move is to turn around and then take a step forward. And so we need a new story. The scientists are telling us that we're not greedy bastards. If you look at the archaeology, the evolutionary biology, the anthropology, when pre-humans came down out of the trees in Africa, we were naked, our claws aren't worth much, our teeth are pretty inadequate, we're not as fast as a lion. Our ancestors survived, and thus you and I are here today having this conversation because they not only had a bond to acquire and then defend, this we share with all animals, but they had a drive to bond. They cared about each other. We know this because the archaeology shows and the DNA shows that our ancestors cared for disabled people. They cared for the elderly. One of the early skulls is of an old man who had no teeth. His teeth had fallen out, and he was old. That meant that he could not have cared for himself alone. It's not the survival of the meanest bastard. It's the survival of the best adapted, as Darwin actually said. And it turns out the best adapted are those who care for each other, those who have community. And, say the anthropologists, the other drive that we have is to tell story. We create meaning. And the meaning that we created in neoliberalism is a dead end. It's a blind canyon. We need to turn back and craft a new story of what it means to care for each other and care for creation, care for our earth, and care for our future. And when we do this, we find that we have meaning in our life. Life's worth living. It's worth sharing. This is why we love Facebook. It's why we love getting together in a pub and having a drink with people we don't even know. It's why we strike up conversations with strangers. It's why we're curious about things that are different than us. And if you put all of this together with the principles, for example, of what John Fullerton has called regenerative capitalism, you get a very different economic system, one that lives within the planetary boundaries, that is based on the biomimetic principles of things like in nature, the most abundant ecosystems are where there is diversity. It owes back to ancient spiritual teachings of harmony and of balance in life. It recognizes that money is useful, but money's not wealth, it's not well-being. And it takes care of place, of community. We can have a vibrant global economy. I'm very fond of Scottish whiskey. We make great whiskey here in Colorado, but I'm happy to trade for good Scotch so long as every place, both the communities in Scotland and the communities here in Colorado, retain their integrity. And these principles of what is now coming to be called regenerative economics just make a lot more sense than the cheater capitalism that we've been practicing.
So that what you call cheater capitalism, I guess the two main things that are working against us there is one, its obsession with GDP growth, and then the other is its side effect of economic inequality.
You know, what is GDP? A man named Simon Kuznets created it to try to understand national accounts, tracking of money throughout an economy. Kuznets was very clear, this is not a good measure of human well-being. But we have taken it to become that. So if a divorcing cancer patient gets in a car wreck, she will add to the GDP, medical bills and lawyer bills and car repair bills. Is she any better off? Clearly not. If that same woman stays home and takes care of her ailing father and her children and volunteers in the local community, it does nothing to increase GDP, but she and her parents, her kids, the whole community are vastly better off. We need a new metric of what it is that we actually want more of. Growth is not necessarily a bad thing. I think the question is growth of what? For example, a team of us built a little exchange-traded fund. This is a thing you can buy on the New York Stock Exchange. It's an investment vehicle. If you want to know more about it, check out changefinance.com. It's very high environment, social, good governance standards. So it's the best companies that you can own, 100 large cap American companies. And I want to grow the heck out of that thing. I want people to take their money out of fossil stocks and put it into clean companies. If the New York Common Fund had divested from ownership in fossil stocks 10 years ago, they would have made $17.5 billion more than they did. Owning fossil stocks turns out not to be a great investment. So we need growth in things like solar energy, the use of it. We need growth in happiness, in an educated citizenry. We need more art and culture and music. Here in Colorado, there was a ballot initiative in the November election which would have limited hydraulic fracturing, breaking the earth apart to try to get more natural gas. It failed because in the end, the oil companies put $30 million into telling everybody that the extractive industries are the basis of Colorado prosperity. This is the basis of our jobs. We need these industries. And the measure lost. Afterward, I thought, is that really true? So my team at Natural Capitalism Solutions started doing some research. What is the Colorado economy? It turns out the Boulder natural foods industry is already bigger than all of conventional agriculture in the state.
Wow.
The outdoor industries is 4 times the size of all extractive industries: oil, gas, coal, timber, mining, conventional agriculture. Clean tech is almost as big as oil and gas in terms of revenues, number of jobs created, and it's going up while oil and gas are declining. If you put all of what might be called the more regenerative industries together, they're a much bigger economy already in Colorado than the extractive industries. Mm-hmm. But nobody knows this side of the story. So this is what a group of us are now doing. We have created what's called a regenerative communities hub in the Denver Boulder area. This is a system that John Fullerton has put together with these hubs being created around the world. There are 7 of them up and running, and 40 more that want to come into effect. And we will be looking at what will it take to build a truly regenerative economy here along the Front Range in Colorado.
Is this hub something that a listener can join or a business can join, or how does it work?
Sure. Check out regencommunities.net. The webmaster will give you permission to come in, and you can see what these hubs are doing, and you can create one of your own. There are hubs starting up in Costa Rica, various places in Europe, Australia, across the United States. And this is another thing that we need to grow a lot more of: community engagement and people building sustainable, locally based economies.
Well, that's good stuff. Now, you wrote about the millions of jobs in clean energy, and actually not just in clean energy, but in this regenerative agriculture as well. And I found myself thinking, well, that's definitely the better place for us to have jobs, but will we survive if each of those jobs is a family that then spends that income flying to their vacation home in Florida or Phoenix and living the quote-unquote good life?
We definitely need to rethink what the good life is. The way in which humanity is trampling the earth will stop. As Dennis Meadows says, when something is unsustainable, that means it will stop. Either we stop it because we find better ways to fulfill ourselves, and we come to live lives of greater equity, lives that are within the planetary boundaries, or it will stop because we all become very miserable and die. There are now 67 million refugees fleeing failed states, places where it's gotten too hot to conduct agriculture, civil wars, religious tensions. This can get much worse. Or we can use the sustainable approaches to begin solving these problems. What we spend now on makeup would pay for reproductive health care the world around. What we spend buying bottled water would pay for clean water the world around 3 times over. There's plenty of money. We're just not spending it very wisely. The fans of artificial intelligence now tell us that within about 10 years' time, 40% of jobs as we know them today will disappear. Just the autonomous vehicles will put out of work 8 million of today's drivers. The General Motors' choice to shut down its Lordstown, Ohio manufacturing facility may turn that town into a ghost town. We literally are going to have to reinvent everything about our economy. The best proposal I've seen comes out of some economists, Randall Wray at the Bard College Levy Center. It's called Guaranteed Jobs, and it's now being picked up in things like the Green New Deal. Several of the presidential candidates are talking about it. The idea is the government pays any nonprofit, or I believe local government, possibly even small business, however much they can usefully deploy putting people to work, doing the jobs that we need. So we need more elder care. That's something a robot will do badly. We need more child care. We need more restoration of damaged ecosystems. There are a lot of jobs that are needed in society. It's just that our cheater capitalism, as my friend Randy Hayes calls it, won't pay for it today. So let's start paying for what we want more of and pruning away the industries that no longer serve us and choosing intentionally what kind of a world we want to live in. Again, wherever this has been done, the evidence is it makes you happier, it makes you wealthier, it gives you a higher quality of life, it leads to better communities. I'd say let's give it a go before it's too late.
Great example of how this book really is a great roadmap, showing us a pretty positive way into the future. I'd like to ask you one last question, Hunter, because it's something that not very many people write about. You didn't avoid the population subject, and I want to thank you for including that in the book and just give you a chance to maybe explain this very important point when it comes to human population. Trend is not destiny.
Not only is trend not destiny, this is a matter of choice. Dr. Malcolm Potts, scientist at the University of California, Berkeley School of Public Health, showed years ago that if we do 5 things, population growth goes to 0. We achieve ZPG, zero population growth, and we have happier, healthier families wherever this is done. The 5 things are, first of all, you feed people. You end hunger. Second, you reform land tenure so that poor people have a deed to the piece of ground they're sitting on. This enables them to enter the capitalist system. They can take out a mortgage, they have a business address, They also have security in their lives. Third, you educate people, particularly women. Fourth, you give information about, and fifth, access to contraception. You enable women to choose. When they have choice, women tend to limit their families. There's no coercion. It's just the way they would prefer to be. If they know their children are going to survive into old age, if they have the knowledge to have a job, if they have, again, security of tenure in their home, they have smaller families. My friend Ashok Khosla, who runs a great group called Development Alternatives, found that if he creates little businesses in villages that hire women, give them a high-quality job with a high-quality wage, they delay having children until they're in their late 20s, early 30s. This eliminates 10 generations who otherwise would have been born. The women tend to have 1 or 2 children. They do a much better job of taking care of them. And you have a much healthier community, society, and you don't have the challenges of overpopulation, which are plaguing us now.
Can I cheat and ask you one last question?
Certainly.
I meant to ask you this at the top of the conversation, and we just kind of got onto a different track. Hunter, you hang out with political leaders and business leaders around the world, and I just want to know, do they get it? Do they understand that we're in overshoot and that we are facing potential civilizational collapse if we don't really reinvent ourselves?
It obviously depends to whom you're speaking. Some of them know this very well, but they are trapped in a system where they are rewarded for not taking risks. This is particularly true in government, but it's also true in most corporations. Tenure of a typical CEO is 3-4 years. You've clawed your way to the top of the food chain. You are personally rewarded, again because of this idiocy of neoliberalism, the belief in the primacy of shareholder value, with stock, which has to be at its height at the point at which you retire or you're not going to get your payout. So you do what folk like Jack Welch did. You fire a lot of people. He was the CEO of General Electric, drove stock to an all-time high, certainly didn't help any of those people. You don't take a risk because, oh my God, the stock might go down. So this is why I revere business leaders like Paul Polman, who just retired from Unilever so he can devote himself more to working with things like the B team, the elders, the UN. Within a week of becoming CEO at Unilever, he said, we're not going to report quarterly. Stock fell 10%. He said, I respect you as human beings, those of you who have sold, but if you think I can best manage your asset on a 90-day rotation, I don't want you as my owners. Unilever stock then went to all-time highs, and then the raiders came around. Kraft Heinz, 3G, Warren Buffett, saying, oh, this is a friendly offer. And it was very clear what they wanted to do was the same thing they had done at their companies, fire a lot of people, cut all of the sustainability programs that Paul had put in place. It took Paul all of 24 hours to say, no. And so it's rather piquant right now to watch the collapse of Kraft Heinz and Warren Buffett saying, I think I made a mistake combining those two companies. The companies that commit to behaving more sustainably are the ones who are doing better. And we find this with our investment philosophy. If you behave responsibly to people and planet, you cut your risks, you cut your costs, you're better able to attract and retain the best talent. You better differentiate your product lines. Unilever found, for example, that its purpose-driven brands, when they started on this, they had 17 of them out of the several hundred brands they had, were delivering 60% of their profitability. They were the fastest growing brands. So they said to all of their brands, go find your authentic purpose. When you engage people, particularly young people, when they have a say in how they're doing their job, when they are able as part of their day job to be implementing more sustainability, this is what gives you the higher productivity of labor, and that then delivers higher profitability. Engaged workforces have 18% higher productivity, 16% higher profitability. Again, this is just better business. So this is what we teach, for example, at the Bard MBA, where I teach, in which sustainability is woven into every class we teach. It's not a bolt-on, it's not an elective. It's the way we teach how to do accounting or strategy. I think it's going to turn out better business leaders.
Well, Hunter, thanks so much for this conversation. I hate to bring it to a close. We could have taken a deep dive down any of the avenues that we got into, but we'll save those conversations for another time. If you'd like to have the last word, any final thoughts?
Thanks to all of you who listen to this podcast. Thanks for caring. What you do, the choices you make in your life, are what will determine the future of humanity. And Dave, I'm deeply grateful to you for all the work that you've always done. And I'm grateful to your listeners that they take the time and that they care. Together we can build a finer future.
Wow, I really missed out on such a stimulating conversation. Hunter really earns the title for being Newsweek's green business icon.
Well, I'm sorry you didn't get to be involved in that. I do think very highly of Hunter. I will admit, and I don't know whether you could tell from the interview, but I'm not 100% in lockstep with her. I think the gist of the book is that we aren't doomed, and the things we need to do to get our system tuned up and back in sustainable balance with nature are actually profitable. And I would expect that kind of message from Hunter because she spends almost all of her time and energy advising top management of big companies. So that keeps her nonprofit going, and it also is really doing a good service. I mean, we really do need the big companies of the world to be rethinking their bottom line, rethinking their goals, and trying to find the cure for growth addiction, trying to operate with a more sustainable moral code and a little bit less of a profit maximization code. So that's a good thing, and Hunter's found a way to speak their language.
Yeah, and she says that we are already in the process of seeing a 180 global shift in our energy and economic infrastructures. And she points that this isn't because people are interested in saving the polar bears or saving our environment necessarily, but it's really more about being better business. And that makes sense because she's speaking to people who live and breathe economics and business and all things that I do not. Projections about the complete dissolution of non-renewables by 2030 sounds a little bit like Andrew McAfee and what he says about how eventually developing nations will be demanding more technology and that we're going to willingly provide access to these technologies because we want to see them become richer. And in a sense, I would like to see an end to mass human suffering, but the amount of power needed to make a significant impact is immense. And I think that ultimately it comes down to one thing: significant cultural and ideational shifts.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought that up because we definitely need those. I do not think that we can make the move to sustainable human civilization simply by doing good business. We're going to have to really rethink things, and we've got to definitely rethink our whole approach to the economy. If we stay addicted to robust economic growth, we'll never be able to get the infrastructure in place to provide renewable energy to power, just like you said, to power that huge economy and a continually growing economy. Plus, we're not going to solve all the other sustainability challenges. It's not just climate change. Shifting to renewables and a finer future really is all about reducing carbon emissions, and that's certainly important, but shifting to renewables doesn't do anything for us in terms of depletion of fertile soils, desertification, the fact that we're pumping major rivers and aquifers dry, and driving other species off the planet. Those things all require us to do something else, and that is really get serious about addressing the problem we have with just the sheer scale of the human enterprise, which is both our economy and our population.
Right. Well said. We can have all of these new policies and new technologies to solve the problems we have today, but we're just bound to repeat history if we don't take responsibility for the way that we're living. This means a reexamination of our definition of success, what it means to lead a meaningful life, ideas about family size, and thinking more about where and how we are investing our money.
Yeah, good point. It's good that she is speaking the language of people who are pulling really big levers and hopefully moving them in the right direction. But there's a lot of work to be done. And I was curious about what you thought when Hunter and I did talk a little bit about population, and she seemed to feel like if we can get zero population growth, and that solves the population side of the equation.
Yeah, I agreed with a lot of what Hunter had to say about giving women the freedom to choose what to do with their bodies. I am, and have been for a very long time, an advocate for women's reproductive rights. And I really liked that she also referenced Dr. Malcolm Potts at UC Berkeley, who has made some really positive contributions as the former chair of the Bixby Center for Population Health and Sustainability. They're dedicated to research aimed at achieving slower population growth and addressing the unmet need for family planning in some of the world's poorest nations. So just knowing Dr. Potts' work, I agree with everything she had to say about his 5 ways to achieve ZPG. We can agree on that, but it's also a downstream solution. We really need to define what it means to be a family today. I sound like a broken record, but I don't think that we can achieve zero population. Any demographer will tell you that it's never stable. It's constantly fluctuating. And the reason it fluctuates is because people change every single day. And I want to see some bigger changes, some bigger cultural shifts when it comes to establishing bonds and what it means to bring life into the world. I don't want to continue to see this marriage equals 2.5 children, white picket fence, living the good life idea continue to exist, because that's just not sustainable.
Well, all important points, but what you've left unsaid, tell me if you disagree, but I'd be shocked if you did. My main hang-up with that is that just ending population growth doesn't solve the problem when you are way overpopulated. So here we are with 7.7 billion people on the planet. There is no way the entire population of the Earth is going to be willing to live simply enough that 7.7 billion people aren't destroying our life-supporting ecosystems. So our population has got to contract back to a lower level that will match up in some kind of sustainable balance with a decent life that everybody's entitled to live. The best science that we have on that is we're looking at a target of 2 billion people, or probably under 3 billion anyway. So ZPG, zero population growth, that basically kind of freezes us, even if we're fluctuating a little bit, plus or minus. If we're hovering around 7.7 billion, we're pretty well sunk. We need to get back down to 2 or 3 billion people and then fluctuate a little bit around that.
Yeah, and she also didn't make the distinction between what national population growth versus global population growth. I mean, we're already seeing birth declines in a number of countries around the world, but that's still not enough. You and I would say that's a good thing. That's a positive thing that people are having less babies, but that's only in a number of countries.
Yeah, and it needs to be lower even in the countries where we're making progress. We can't say mission accomplished, because when you're at 7.7 billion and your planet is crumbling beneath your feet, we need to let our population shrink as fast as possible. So we got work to do, whether you're living in a country where the fertility rate is 1.5 or living in a country where the fertility rate is 5. You got work to do either way.
Right.
I do want to make a note. I know Hunter mentioned a fracking ballot initiative in the November election. And because here we are sharing this interview after November of 2019, people might think she's talking about something that was in the November 2019 election. And because we recorded the conversation last February, she was talking about the November 2018 election, just for clarification.
Thank you for that.
Well, I'll just say one last thing about Hunter Lovins. Very smart lady, and she's got a mind like a file cabinet. She's got a good grasp of a lot of facts that all support very well the points that she's trying to make, which are good points.
Yeah, she's really a pleasure to listen to, and I hope to have her here on the show again. I wanted to go ahead and share a video I came across. It is titled Greta Thunberg and George Monbiot Make Short Film on the Climate Crisis.
This is not a drill. My name is Greta Thunberg. We are living in the beginning of a mass extinction. Our climate is breaking down. Children like me are giving up their education to protest. But we can still fix this. You can still fix this. It is that simple. Protect, restore, fund. You can be part of this.
Vote for people who defend nature.
Share this video. Talk about this.
All around the world, there are amazing movements fighting for nature. Join them.
Everything counts. What you do counts.
Well, that's pretty interesting. Great video. I'm a fan of both Greta and George. Here again, I don't agree with everything that George says and believes, but a pretty sharp guy. He's the columnist at the UK Guardian, writes about good subjects, and I got to thank him for that. The thing that bugged me a little bit about the video was toward the end, Greta, I think, says it's that simple. They say, protect, restore, fund. And then she says it's that simple. And I just want to say, well, we definitely want to protect, restore, and fund. They're talking about protecting the nature that will be a big part of the solution that'll suck a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere. But just like I said when I mentioned that solving climate change doesn't do the whole job of getting human civilization back into sustainable balance with nature. Same thing here. It's not that simple. It's a lot more complicated. Yeah, we need to protect, restore, and fund, but we need to do a lot of other things too, like get over our love affair with economic growth and live more simply and find ways to really embrace smaller families so that our population can contract back to a sustainable level. So that's not simple. I mean, it's all doable, but this 3-minute video doesn't cover the whole story. It's a great video, but it's not everything.
Usually when we see Greta, she's really throwing out the facts at you. When she's talking, it's not easy.
Yeah, she's mad.
Yeah, she's mad. Maybe it's a new strategy she's using to get more people to listen, because sometimes, I think I mentioned maybe in a few episodes prior, sometimes when we use extreme language like the climate crisis, for example, that might just scare people altogether. But when you present things in a less critical manner, it might make people feel a little bit more able to take on these challenges.
Well, that's probably a lot of the reasoning behind that book, A Finer Future. I think the jury's out. I don't think we know. And in fact, I'll tell you what, I change my mind probably 20 times a day about that. Sometimes I think people do need to feel like there's some promise, and then sometimes I think, you know what, we just really need to tell them, you are just a few years away from the apocalypse. The time for little baby steps is gone. It is an emergency. At some point you have to yell fire so that everybody can run from the auditorium. But there are a lot of people saying, no, don't yell fire, because everybody will freeze. They'll be paralyzed with fear and do nothing. I don't know. I don't think anyone has the full answer on that.
Right.
Not that you asked me.
I think we do a pretty good job of it. I know at times I'm pretty quick to, in your words, Dave, fawn over some of our guests and think, wow, they do have the answer. They're doing some really great things. And it does. It makes me feel more hopeful. But I'm also glad to have you here at the end of the day, keeping me stable. And I think we have a pretty good balance of that here at the show.
Yeah, and I'm just going to take a risk here and circle back to that conversation with Hunter Lovins and the book, A Finer Future, and recommend read the book. Take it in and get your hope going. But then I want you to check out from the library or order this book by Ozzie Zenner called Green Illusions. And we'll include a link in the show notes. And I want you to watch a new film when it finally comes to a theater near you sometime in 2020 called Planet of the Humans. Because if you read Green Illusions and you see the movie Planet of the Humans, you will have gotten both sides of the story. You'll have gotten the rosy, optimistic picture from A Finer Future, and you will get the brutal, what I'm afraid is probably the cold, hard truth from Planet of the Humans and Green Illusions. And then you can decide for yourself whether you want to sit there in paralysis or party down with the Titanic or decide to live an elegant life with integrity and do your best to leave some thin ray of hope for your children or future generations, if you don't have any children, to have a decent life.
I like that.
All right. That brings you to the end of another amazing podcast about sustainable living, Growth Busters with Erica Arias and Dave Gardner. Thanks so much for listening. Be sure to visit growthbusters.org to explore these issues more thoroughly. And because this is the end of the year, it's the time when everyone has the spirit of giving. I want to encourage you to give a little bit to this project if you appreciate what we're doing. This is a nonprofit project, basically run on fumes year-round. You can click on the donate button at growthbusters.org and help us out.
Thank you so much to our listeners. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, or just want to say hi, don't forget to write to us.
That's right. Podcast@growthbusters.org is the email address.
Take care.
Toodaloo.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some may just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather. But no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling. Call the growth busters.